Alright guys, so welcome back to another video. In today's video, this is going to be a comprehensive tutorial on how to complete the block mod. So for those who don't know too much about the focuses, there was an oversight really from factory in the design of the engine by Volvo, where the gap in the cooling channels between the cylinder liners is too big, and it allows for flex between the cylinder liners over time, which cause the cylinder liners to crack, and then you need a new block and potentially a whole new engine. And there's quite an easy solution for this. People create like a shim kit, and you just put these shims in between the liners to stop them from cracking. It's a super common mod for people to do with focuses, especially if they want to push more power like I do. So I just wanted to get it out the way straight away, and I started with that. That was the first thing I've done to the car, which is why it's been off the road since I got it. Today's video, like I said, is going to be a comprehensive tutorial. It's mainly going to be voiceover from me, just voicing over photos and some videos I took while I was completing the block mod. It obviously involves cylinder head removal, cam belt and water pump replacement, camshaft removal, rocker cover, that sort of stuff, a lot of wiring, a lot of engine components. So I'm going to talk you through it. It's definitely doable by, I wouldn't say a beginner, but it's definitely doable by someone with some sort of mechanical experience. Do you know what I mean? It's very involving, but as long as you're slow and methodical and you follow this video, you should be okay. So I'll talk you through just first off some things that you'll need. So there are some special tools you need to do the timing side of things, and there's sort of 3 or 4 in particular. The first one is an absolute necessity. This is going to be your camshaft locking tools. This locks the 2 camshafts at the top dead center or like timing marks, so that you can put them back in the same place that you took them out. That's an absolute necessity, number 1. Number 2 is something called a crank lock pin. So this is a little pin which goes in a hole behind your starter motor, which will lock your crank at the top dead center / timing mark, so that you can put everything back together once you put the cam belt on. So just to clear something up as well real quick, the timing marks on this is not actually top dead center, but just for ease of use I'll refer to it as top dead center probably. So yeah, but the crank lock pin I didn't use. So in New Zealand I couldn't actually source that pin. I contacted Ford and Volvo directly, asked other enthusiasts in the country. No one actually had that pin. It was out of stock in Australia, so I couldn't actually get that pin, and I still managed to do it. You just got to be extremely careful that you don't rotate the crank. You can lock it with sort of a like a extension, which is what I did to just stop it from rotating, but I'll talk you through that again. So crank lock pin, preferably if you can, not completely necessary. Another tool which people say you need is, it's a crank pulley holding tool. So this is a tool which you put onto the crank pulley to hold it in place while you undo the 30mm crank nut. Again, I did not use this. I used an oil filter wrench, one of those like with the rubber. I'll talk you through that again in the video. So but if you've got one, then all the best, because you don't want to spin your engine anti-clockwise while you're undoing that bolt, which is the reason people use it. And then the last special tool will be not specific to this engine, but a special tool nonetheless. It's a camshaft pulley holder. So this would be to get your camshaft pulleys off when you want to replace the camshaft oil seal. I didn't use this, I did it a different way, which again I'll talk you through. Some other things to note: you obviously need a block mod kit. I'll put a photo now of what one of those looks like. I bought mine from OEM Denied in Australia from a guy called Jamie. He offered me support the whole way through the process as well, so I can't recommend his products enough. It had everything I needed in the kit. Just to go over some of the things you'll need: head gasket, head bolts, cam belt, water pump, camshaft oil seals, VVT solenoid oil seals, and then there's some other stuff you'll need as well. You'll need some sort of anaerobic sealant. You can buy the Volvo genuine one. I didn't. I'll put a photo of what I used. It was Permatex. This will be to seal the water pump. You put a bit of this on the water pump even though it's got a gasket, and then you also use this mainly for sealing your rocker cover. These engines don't have a rocker cover gasket, it's a sealant, so you're going to use that on your rocker cover. That's super important. Another thing which you may need, this wasn't included in the kit. I think you can get away with reusing your old ones if you don't damage them too much in removal, but this is going to be your camshaft end seals. It's a small black cap, sits on the end of the camshaft on the gearbox side of the engine. You have to pry these off with a screwdriver. I think you can do it without damaging them. I didn't want to take the risk. I didn't want an oil leak from there, so I bought replacement ones from Volvo. Put the part numbers on the screen for those of you who want to buy that, because I don't think they're normally included in a block mod kit. You're also going to need 6.4 litres of oil. I used 0 watt 40, that's recommended by Ford. Everyone recommends Castrol 0 watt 40, which is what I used. You're also going to need approximately 5-ish litres of coolant. I used just red coolant. It said it was good for Fords. It was all good. I didn't have any issues. I mentioned something else which is going to really help you along the way. I've organized all my bolts on this piece of cardboard. I just poke the bolts through and label them what they are and put them in the cardboard in the order that I remove them. So when I'm assembling the car back together, this makes it super easy. I know what bolts are for what, and some stuff like that. And I also highly recommend you get a paint pen so you can mark on things like plugs and coil packs and different vacuum hoses and stuff like that. I also used a roll of masking tape and a pen to mark lines, different lines for what they were, where they went to and stuff like that. And obviously taking photos and just following this video in general. I'm also going to put a link in the bottom of this video in the description to some Ford service manuals. So these are PDFs from Ford or Volvo, not sure who they're from, but they're from the actual manufacturer on how to carry out these procedures. These are really helpful along the way for things like torque specs and stuff like that, and if you get stuck. Some of the procedures I didn't follow exactly because I feel like I couldn't understand why you needed to do it this way. I thought there was a better way. And obviously I put my engine back together, no issues. I've been driving it, I've done 200 Ks in it now, pulls, stuff like that for the last few days, and no boost issues, nothing, no head gasket issues, no overheating, everything's fine. But feel free to follow the actual service guide by the book if you want to. But let's go ahead and show you guys how I did it.
Last thing before we start as well, you're going to need a few of these hose clamps because some of the clamps are those irreplaceable ones you have to destroy to get off. So first thing I did was take a few photos of the engine bay before I started, just general area and some close-up details of specific areas. This was so I could use them as reference for when I was putting it back together. Then I removed this slam panel cover by removing the 6 plastic fittings. You can just pry those up with a plastic pry tool. Once you've removed that, there's this little air duct under there, same fittings. There'll be 2 either side and 1 sort of underneath on the front. Just pry those off with a pry tool. Then it's time to remove the wiper blade, so remove the plastic cover over the nut. I used masking tape to mask where the wipers are supposed to sit so I could put them back together, and then just remove that nut. I think it's a 15mm nut. Label which wiper goes where. Pull this wiper rubber off, and then pull those plastic clips outwards, and then you can lift out the wiper cover. And there's that tray underneath. There's a T30 either side which you need to remove. Intake pipe needs to come off. There's 2 10mm bolts, one on the top of the rocker cover and one on the gearbox side on the right hand side, and then there's 2 vacuum pipes that you need to disconnect. The one without the green fitting will go on the left hand side and the one with the green fitting goes on the right hand side. Then you'll be able to disconnect the hose clamp on at either end of this plastic pipe and then wiggle it out. And to disconnect that green tab, all you've got to do is push in either side the green pieces and then pull it off. Next, we'll remove this Duratec ST engine cover. There's just 6 T30s on the top there that you need to remove, and then you can pull that off. So at this point, I labelled all of my coil packs with a paint pen and the coil pack plug that corresponds to it with a dot. So obviously dot 1 for cylinder 1, 5 dots for cylinder 5, so they could go back in the same place they came out. And I also put a rag over my turbo inlet pipe to stop stuff falling down there. But just make sure you use the bright colour rag so you don't forget it. Then I disconnected my battery because I was preparing to remove the airbox and ECU. So here's the airbox you need to remove. Unplug that MAF sensor. Then push this red tab in while pulling the vacuum pipe out to the right so you can release it. Don't force it, otherwise you'll break the vacuum pipe. And then I labelled what the pipe went into, so just labelled it plenum. Then you can remove this flexi piece by just undoing the hose clamp. Remove the MAF sensor. There's 2 T30s, one on the top, one on the bottom. Then you can pull the ECU cover off by just lifting and sliding back. Super easy to get off. Then you can disconnect the ECU plugs. So push down on the top of the tab. There's a bit that says press. You push that down and then pull the red clamp back and it will lever itself out of the plug. Then there's a little T20 right at the bottom which holds that wiring harness to the bottom of the box. Then you can just lift the air filter out, then pull this corrugated little tab out to disconnect the wiring. There's this small plastic tab which is held into the bottom of the airbox. You just need to pull it towards the front of the car and then push it down to get it out of its little slot. Then you can just pull this little flexi part of the airbox pipe out. Also, same thing, pull this elbow out, just give it a bit of a wiggle and push it from the inside. Now, removing the actual airbox is just quite difficult. I'd probably suggest you go and watch an actual video on removing the airbox. You need to first pull it up towards you to pull it out of its locator tabs. They're in rubber, so it's quite tough to pull those out. And then you need to slide it to the right of the car. And then as you get towards the right-hand side of the car and you're close to getting out of the back of the plenum, then rotate it and pull it out. That's the way you need to do it, but make sure you don't break those locator tabs or break a coolant temp sensor, which is right underneath it as well. Like I said, take your time. I suggest watching a separate video just on that.
This is the supposed delete pipe that was here. It just pushed on. I just pulled it off.
Then just pull this rubber piece out of its locator. This is part of the symposer, just to get that out of the way. Then here's that vacuum pipe I was telling you earlier in the video. You'll need some hose clamps to replace. This fitting you have to pull off with pliers and stuff like that just to actually get it off. So you'll need a hose clamp this size to replace that.
Then you can remove this hose clamp which goes onto the bottom of the throttle body. And once you've removed that, you can remove the intake plenum bolts. So there's going to be 6 of these total. 4 are easy to get to, and the last 2, which are over to the driver's side of the vehicle, the left-hand side, are going to be quite difficult. So this is the first one I've just showed you. This one, you're going to need sort of a small ratchet with an 8mm deep socket to get to. And the other one, which is the far one on the end, you're best off using an 8mm flex head ratchet and flex it all the way to like 90 degrees and then put it down in there and then turn it. That's the only way you're going to be able to get it. Well, the only way I found that you're going to be able to get it anyway. So once those 6 bolts are fully removed, you can just lift the intake manifold up and out. Make sure you disconnect this last vacuum pipe that goes to the back of the plenum. And then you want to tape over the plenum inlets with tape so nothing falls into it. Then you can go ahead and go under the car, find your oil cooler, which is going to be on the back of the block, just behind the sump, and pull off one of those coolant lines so that you can drain all the coolant out of the car. Now you can go ahead and remove your alternator belts. Or auxiliary belts. There's 2 of them on the Focus ST. One at the front, which just runs from the crank to the air compressor, and then you just stick I think it's a T45 or a T55 into the tensioner and release the tension to get the first belt off. Then you can remove that tensioner and then do the same thing on the second belt, which runs again from the AC compressor up to the alternator and then through the tensioner. Then you can remove the coolant expansion tank. It's just held in on these 2 little tabs, and then there's a coolant hose that's under it at the back with just a compression fitting that you can pull off. And then I just moved the pipes over so I could move the coolant expansion tank over to the front of the engine down where the oil filter housing is. Then I removed this vacuum hose, which goes from the rocker cover down to the oil filter housing. And once that was removed, I removed this turbo crossover hose. It's just a 7mm hose clamp right down at the bottom. I had to end up moving this out of the way just so I could actually get the turbo heat shield out. This is held on with 4 bolts, one 10mm which you can see there, and then there's 3 other 10mm which go onto the back side of the block. I'll try show you the locations of them with a mirror. So there's that one there, that's just a regular 10mm, and the other 2 fittings are springed 10mm. So you need to make sure you put those like that, those springed ones, back in the locations that you took them out of. The turbo heat shield was really difficult for me to get out, which is why I had to end up removing that turbo crossover hose. And the way to get that heat shield out is to push it as far back towards the bulkhead as you can, and then angle the driver's side up and try wiggle it out. There are some hard, I think they're coolant lines that the turbo heat shield sits over the top of, so you just got to be careful when you're maneuvering it over those. You might need to even bend and manipulate that heat shield a little bit, but you'll be able to wiggle it out. And then once you've done that, we move on to removing some of the wiring. So this is a lot simpler than I thought it was going to be, as long as you label everything and just take photos and realize where it's got to go back. So first thing you need to do, remove the zip tie for this vacuum line and remove the O2 sensor plug that's on the left of it. Remove these 2 bolts which hold the plastic wiring harness to the side of the block. Then you can remove these 2 bolts, which hold this bracket onto the side of the block. It's the engine crane bracket. Then also attached to that bracket is this 8mm nut, which holds the hard fuel line on. And then once you've removed those 3 things, you can remove that whole bracket altogether. Then you can unplug your VVT solenoid sensors. Make sure you label the plugs so you don't plug the wrong ones into each other. Then you can remove the 2 plugs on the other end of the rocker cover. These are your camshaft position sensors. Then you can remove the 2 earthing straps that sit on the top of the rocker cover. The first one sits in between cylinders 2 and 3, and the other one in between cylinders 4 and 5, and it's secured with an 8mm nut. Then the wiring harness can be wiggled out of the way. Then I removed my crank pulley by holding onto it with an oil filter wrench so it wouldn't spin anti-clockwise, and then I gunned off that big 30mm nut with an impact wrench. Then I removed the cam belt cover, which is these little rubber cover hold on with these 10mm nuts, and then I removed the actual crank pulley by using a harmonic balancer pulley kit tool thing to actually pull it off. But you can also use a 3-jaw puller that'd also work to pull it off. Then I removed the upper engine mount. So you remove this big U-shaped bracket, which is held on with some, I think there's 16mm bolts, and then the other 2 bolts which bolt the actual engine mount to the side of the block, and then that engine mount can just be lifted out. But make sure you're supporting the engine with a jack underneath, otherwise your engine will just drop out the car. Next, I removed the 12 exhaust manifold studs. So these are 13mm nuts. So it's a 13mm nut with a washer and then on a stud. Some of them for me came out as studs, other of them came out as nuts. Either way, it doesn't matter. You just want to lube these all up with WD-40 probably the night before you attempt to do them, because you're very likely to snap them. Some people even suggest buying spare exhaust studs before you go ahead and do it. I didn't end up snapping any of them, so I was quite lucky there. The 2 that are on the left-hand side of the block, the side of the engine mount, those 2 are very difficult to get to, and I found it's best using a regular shallow 13mm socket and a small extension. It's also going to be really handy if you have a flex head ratchet. That'll also be super helpful for removing these. Then I removed the actual intake manifold by removing these 6 10mm nuts. Then there's a fuel line which will sit on top of the intake manifold. That is a little small Phillips head screw on a plastic fitting, and then you undo the Phillips head screw and pull the plastic fitting up to remove that hard fuel line. Then there's a big 90-degree soft pipe that's not held on with any clamps or anything. That goes to the oil filter housing. You can just wiggle that off. Then on the left-hand side, there's a vacuum hose. So it's a rubber, like 90-degree rubber bit with one of those sacrificial fittings you have to break off. You need to remove that. And then you can pull the intake manifold off, I believe. You need to also remove the coolant temperature sensor. Unfortunately, I didn't take any photos of this, so you might want to Google some photos or watch a separate video on that. Then I removed this middle cam belt cover, which is just held on with a T30 Torx screw. And then I used a 30mm nut on a 1/2-inch drive ratchet to set my engine to top dead center, or where the timing marks align, which you can see on this photo here. You just need to get yourself level with that mark. And if you have a crank lock pin, this is the time where you put it in. Now, your timing marks on the camshafts are very unlikely to actually line up with the top cover, and this is because these covers warp over time with heat. But this is okay, because you'll know if it's at top dead center if you can get your cam locking tool in, which I'll show you what you need to do for that now. So there's these 2 black caps on the gearbox side of the rocker cover. These you need to pry off with a screwdriver, and then they'll expose these T30 Torx bit screws. These are extremely tight screws that are put in with Loctite from the factory, and you're extremely likely to strip them or snap Torx bits, and I snapped 2 of them. The way that I found to get them out, people will tell you need impact screwdrivers or an impact and all this stuff. The way that I actually found to get them out was I had to heat them up with just a lighter, heat them up for a good few minutes, and then slowly with just a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, I turned them off with a Torx bit. I still managed to twist my Torx bit by hand getting them out, but this is an extremely difficult step. But once you've got those 2 T30 Torx bits out, you can then remove the 2 things that go on the end of the camshaft. I'm not actually quite sure what they are. These are sided, so there's one side for the intake cam, one side for the exhaust cam, but you can't mix them up because of the little key slots in the back of them. You can't actually mix them up, but you should just put them aside anyway in an order you'll remember to put them back on. But yeah, once you've done that, you can fit your cam locking tool. Your cam locking tool, again, sided, so you can't actually mess that up, and then lock the two cams together, and then you can remove your timing belt. So there's two different types of cam belt tensioners. There's an automatic type or a manual type of tensioner. The automatic type is the one on the right hand side here, but either way, whichever one you have, it doesn't matter. You just need a 6mm Allen key, and you turn that to release tension, and then you can slide the belt off. Okay, so now it's finally time to start disassembling the engine. First things first, you need to remove your rocker cover. So the design of the rocker cover on this Focus engine is that the rocker cover actually bolts down the camshaft as well. So these bolts need to be removed. All rocker cover bolts need to be removed in a sequence anyway, but these ones need to be removed especially carefully. So you're supposed to turn them 2 turns. So you start on number 1, turn it 2 turns, go to number 2, 2 turns, all the way till you get to number 46, and then you start again back at 1, 2 turns again until they're all loose. This is because you want to release the tension evenly on the rocker cover, and you don't want to end up warping it. So make sure you follow this torque sequence, remove them in the correct order, and then there'll be spots on the actual rocker cover for you to pry off. I found that a 3/8 extension bar fits in there perfectly. So you put the 3/8 extension bar in those slots. There's 2 on the front, 3 on the back, and then you'll be able to just turn it on a ratchet, which breaks the seal and pops that rocker cover off, and then you'll be able to lift it off the car. Once that rocker cover's out the way, you'll be able to lift your camshafts out, lift them out together with them still locked, and then place them down. Make sure you know which cam is the exhaust cam and which cam's the intake cam, so you don't turn them around or whatever, and you can put them back in the same way. Once you've done that, you can now remove your head bolts. This is super important. Again, needs to be removed in the particular torque sequence. Again, not to warp the head. It's going to be a 14mm socket, and you're going to want a deep socket, and it needs to be quite a long one. I had to go buy a specific deep socket to do this. And they're torqued up really tight, so make sure you use a breaker bar and a 14mm socket that's 1/2-inch drive. And then once you've removed all 12 of those, you can lift the cylinder head off. You want to make sure that you lift it up and then out, because you don't want to drag it along the head. If some of your exhaust bolts came out as nuts rather than studs, also be aware that you're going to have to lift and pull those studs out of that exhaust manifold. But it's a lot easier than it sounds, and you'll be sweet. So get those 12 bolts out, pull the head off. Congratulations, you're now halfway there. All the disassembly is done, and now it's time for reassembly. So the first thing you want to do at this point is to remove the exhaust manifold gasket and the head gasket, because these are going straight into the bin, and you need to clean these surfaces. So you want to clean them with a razor blade, and you want the razor blade to be perpendicular to the surface that you're scraping, and then scrape obviously side to side. Just be ultra careful that you don't gouge into the surface. You're just scraping along the top of the surface to remove the bulk of the old gaskets that are there. Once the bulk's removed, you can then use brake cleaner and Scotch-Brite to remove the rest of it until you've got a clean surface, which should look something along the lines of what mine looks like here in these photos. You now need to repeat the same cleaning process on the cylinder head. But before you rotate the cylinder head, this is crucial, you need to remove the 20 lifters out of the head. Otherwise, when you turn it upside down, these will fall out. And these are all machined specifically for each slot which they go into, so you cannot mess them up. Some people label them when they take them out. I just literally took them out and plopped them right next to where they need to go. Flip the head, clean the underside, flipped it back, and put them all back in. Whilst the head is off the car as well, you need to remove the 5 O-rings which go around the spark plug tubes. And then when you put your lifters back in, I cleaned them all off with brake cleaner and then pre-oiled them, the outsides and the inside, with just a bit of oil on my finger, lube them up, put them back in. You'll also need to clean the mating surfaces for the exhaust manifold and the intake manifold. Now it's finally time to install the block mod shims. All of this work just to install these little shims. So you want to put these in the freezer for 24 hours before you install them. This is to shrink them and make them easier to slot in between the cylinder liners. You just want to line them up as central as you can and then tap them in with a hammer. I just used like a 1 ounce rubber mallet and tap them in till they're flush with the surface. Now you can place your head gasket onto the head. Just make sure you've got it in the correct orientation and it's aligned on the 2 dowels on the top of the head. Once you've done that, you can put the exhaust manifold gasket onto the studs that you've got remaining in the back of the block, and then it's time to reinstall the cylinder head. So to put the cylinder head back on, you just want to slot it into those the exhaust manifold at the back and place it down onto the 2 locating dowels. Try not to move it and slide it back and forth too much, otherwise you might risk damaging the head gasket. Once you've got the head correctly located, you can install the 12 new cylinder head bolts that you've got. So these bolts have to be new because they're stretch bolts. The torque sequence for these bolts is the opposite order of the removal sequence, and there's 3 torque stages. The first is 20 Newton meters, then 60 Newton meters, and the next one is 130 degrees. So to do this, I used a torque angle gauge. Realistically, you need to have a actual torque wrench with an angle gauge built in, but they're thousands of dollars, and this actually seemed to work quite accurately for me. I did some testing before I decided to use it on the head bolts, and I felt like it measured the angle quite accurately, so I decided to use that, and I've not had any issues since. But make sure you torque these in the correct sequence, so 20, then 60, then 130. Once the cylinder head's back on, you can put this vacuum pipe, which runs down the back of the block to the turbo and round the front to the intake manifold. If you forget to install this pipe now, it's going to cost you hours of work in the future, which is what it did to me. I ended up having to redo 5 hours worth of work, so make sure you don't forget this pipe. Now you need to clean the surface of your rocker cover before you install your anaerobic sealant. So Volvo say that you have to put this sealant across the entire mating surfaces. This is what it looked like when I had my sealant on. So just try replicate something like this and make sure you don't have it in any of the oil galleries. If you do, then just clean it out with like a cotton earbud. Whilst at this stage as well, you need to make sure you install your new 5 spark plug O-ring gaskets and the 2 green VVT solenoid gaskets as well. Now you need to put your camshafts back into the cylinder head. Before you put your rocker cover back on, you need to replace these red camshaft oil seals. The actual Ford way to do this, I've linked in the description below. All I did was unlock my cams, slide the O-ring off the end, and then slide the new one on. This isn't the correct way to do it, but that's the way I did it, and I didn't have any issues. Now, you can place your rocker cover back onto the cylinder head. What you're supposed to do before you torque these bolts down is to unlock your cams at this position and then torque the bolts down. This is so that you don't bend a valve. Now, I didn't unlock my cams when I torqued it down because I really struggled to understand why I needed to do this. And I talked to some mechanic friends of mine and they told me that I should be fine. And lo and behold, I left them locked and I didn't bend any valves and it was fine. But I just want you to be aware that this isn't the Ford recommended way to do this. And the method for correct install is in the description below. But again, this is the way I did it and I didn't have any issues. So now you can torque down the rocker cover following this new torque sequence. So you work inside out with the torquing of the bolts. Again, 2 turns at a time until they're torqued down to 17 Newton meters. You really want to be careful when you're doing this because you are pulling the rocker cover down quite a lot when you torque these bolts down. So make sure you follow this torque sequence until the rocker cover is all torqued down. Then I replaced my water pump and the water pump gasket. This is quite easy, but you just got to take your time when you're doing it. It's 7 10mm bolts. I had the engine either jacked all the way up or all the way down, depending on which 10mm bolt I was trying to access. And I also used a bit of the anaerobic sealant on the gasket and on the water pump when I was putting it back on. This helped to hold the gasket in place. There are 2 aligning dowels that you use to line that gasket up. And again, you need to make sure all the mating surfaces are clean with the razor blade and the Scotch-Brite. Then I replaced my idler pulley. It's just 2 10mm bolts and this sits towards the top right hand side of the engine. Then I fit my new tensioner. This was just put in loosely with a 10mm bolt in the middle and then set to its loosest setting. Then it's time to put the engine bracket back on, this like triangle bracket that bolts onto the side of the block, and now you can install your new cam belt. So it's very, I found it quite tricky installing the new cam belt. I suggest watching a proper video on that, and I've linked one in the description below. And what you want to do is put it on your crank pulley first, the crankshaft first. Then keep tension on the right hand side, going all the way up over the right, over the idler pulley, the intake cam, and then over the exhaust cam. Then I zip tied it onto the exhaust cam to keep tension, and then went down underneath the car and looped it over the water pump and the tensioner. It took me over an hour to install this. I don't know if that's bad or whatnot. I think it is, but yeah, it was quite difficult. But just stick with it, because this is sort of the last part of the job. Once you have got this cam belt fitted, you need to make sure that your engine is still correctly timed. The way that you do this is you take off your camshaft locking tools or your crankshaft lock pin if you have that. Then you need to rotate your engine clockwise twice until your crank timing marks align again. Once you've got it so your crank timing marks align again, you now need to reinstall your cam locking tool. If you can reinstall the cam locking tool, that means your engine is still all in time. Whilst you're turning the engine by hand, if you start to feel resistance and it starts to bind up, what you're feeling there is the valve touching at the top of the piston, which means your timing is now misaligned, and you need to take the belt back off, rotate either the cam or the crank a few teeth over by hand, and then start again. But you shouldn't be in this mess if you've kept your crank timing marks aligned and your camshafts locked, or even use the crank lock pin is the best way to do it. Once you've done all that super stressful and hard part, you've got a nice easy job, which is replacing your oil filter. Best do this while the intake manifold's off for easier access. And then you're done. All you got to do now is reassemble everything you've disassembled. So rewind through this video and look at your own photos to reassemble everything on the engine. Now you're about ready for your first startup. Before you start the car, what you want to do is, with the old engine oil in there, you just want to disconnect your fuel injectors and then crank the engine over for about 2-3 seconds, not long. This is so that you can get the old oil circling around through the engine and picking up all the Scotch-Brite and the brake cleaner that's gone through your oil galleries and taking it down into your oil sump. You can then drain the oil out, replace your oil sump sump washer, and put that back in. Top up with the new oil. Like I said, it's about 6.4 litres of the 0 watt 40. And then with your fuel injector still disconnected, I cranked my engine over for about 10 cranks, waited a minute, did the same again, and then I went and did my first startup injectors and actually started the car for the first ever time since doing this job. It smoked heavily, as you guys can see in this video. Don't be alarmed at this point. This is most likely just WD-40 and some copper slip and stuff like that, and old engine oil burning off. But if it persists for more than about 5 minutes, then I'd probably turn the car off and inspect your exhaust manifold gasket and see if you've spilt anything massively that's burning off. Another thing you want to make sure you do on this first startup is have your heaters on the max heat and the max fan speed so you can bleed the coolant system, because you've obviously just drained a lot of it and topped it back up. So what I did on my first startup was let the car warm all the way up to temperature, to 90 degrees. Then I turned it off, let the cooling system all cool down, then re-topped it up and took it for its first ever test drive since the block mod. On the first drive, I just went on a small drive, let it come all the way up to temp and then back down. And I didn't boost it at all because I just wanted to go slow for the first one. I took it on about 3 or 4 of those smaller test drives. Then I took it out, easing on the boost, so just doing half throttle pulls, then like 3/4 throttle pulls, until finally I was doing some full throttle pulls. Just whilst I was doing this, I'm constantly pulling over, checking for any leaks under the engine, stuff like that, checking everything's still plugged in, keeping an eye on my oil temp and oil pressure gauges, and just generally looking over the car, making sure everything's good. But if you followed this video, hopefully you guys managed to put it back together, and hopefully this video was helpful. I've tried to cover everything that I thought I needed to share with you guys if you're going to do your own block mod, so hopefully it was helpful. If you have any questions, a good person that I can recommend to contact is Jamie from OEM Denied, or even myself in the comments section of this video. I'll be able to try and help each of you guys on doing your block mod. Like I said, it's definitely something which is possible to do at home. I didn't use any fancy tools. So yeah, good luck, and let me know how it goes in the comments below.